The neighborhood was the kind of place where lawns gleamed like polished emeralds, and every mailbox looked like it had been measured with a ruler. The Homeowners Association had a reputation for strictness, but it wasn't the HOA that caused most of the headaches. It was the people. In every neat little cul-de-sac, there was always someone who took the rules a bit too seriously, someone who decided they were the enforcer. For me, that person was my next-door neighbor, Glenn. My house sat at the end of a quiet street, bordered by a tall, sprawling oak tree that shaded nearly half my yard. The tree was older than any of us, massive, gnarled, with a trunk so wide it would take two people to wrap their arms around it. It had been there long before the neighborhood was built, a relic of the old farmland that once covered the area. Birds nested in it, squirrels darted along its branches, and in the summer, its leaves shimmered gold in the sunlight. It was my favorite thing about the property, peaceful, grounding, and full of life. But Glenn saw it differently. Glenn moved in about a year after I did. He was one of those men who believed that everything around him should obey his sense of order. His lawn was trimmed like a pudding green, his driveway spotless, his hedges cut into perfect cubes. He took measurements of his grass with a ruler and complained to the HOA if anyone's trash bins were visible for more than 5 minutes after pickup. He didn't just live by the rules. He weaponized them. It started small, as most conflicts do. Glenn complained that the tree's shade extended onto his lawn, affecting grass growth. I shrugged it off. A few weeks later, he mentioned that the roots might be spreading toward his property line. Then he claimed the falling leaves were creating a mess on his side. Each time, his tone grew sharper, his complaints more aggressive. I had done my research. The tree was fully within my property. The roots and branches that crossed the invisible boundary were minimal and perfectly legal. Still, I offered to rake up any leaves that landed on his side. It wasn't enough for Glenn. He didn't want cooperation. He wanted control. One morning, I woke to the sound of heavy machinery. The growl of an engine vibrated through the walls. I stepped outside, half asleep, coffee mug in hand, and froze. Glenn was standing in his driveway, gesturing at the tree while a landscaping crew unloaded chainsaws and ropes. They were preparing to cut down the oak. At first, I thought it was a misunderstanding, that they were trimming something else. But then one of the workers walked straight toward the base of my tree, measuring where to start the first cut. I stopped them immediately, demanding to know what they were doing. They pointed to Glenn, who was barking instructions, acting like he had every right to make the decision. He claimed the tree was hazardous, that it endangered his property, that it needed to come down for safety reasons. It wasn't just arrogance. It was entitlement. Glenn had convinced himself that if something inconvenienced him, it didn't deserve to exist. The workers hesitated when I told them the tree was mine. Without paperwork or official clearance, they backed off, leaving Glenn fuming in his driveway. But the damage was done. The confrontation drew attention. Other neighbors peeked from behind curtains, whispering. The next OA meeting was tense. Glenn accused me of neglecting property safety, while I defended my right to preserve a tree that posed no danger. The HOA board took his side, at least partially. They issued a review notice, claiming they would assess whether the tree was a community concern. I knew what that meant. Glenn had connections on the board, and he was using them. For weeks, I lived under scrutiny. HOA inspectors came by with clipboards, taking photos and notes. Glenn lingered outside, pretending to garden while he watched them. It became a silent war of nerves. But the irony was the tree remained as sturdy and majestic as ever. During storms, its branches barely swayed. Its roots kept my soil from eroding, and the shade kept my house cool in the brutal summer heat. Nature was on my side, and I wasn't about to let someone destroy it out of vanity. Then, late one evening, I noticed something odd. The ground near the tree looked disturbed. Fresh dirt, small holes like someone had been digging. At first, I thought maybe an animal had been searching for something, but the holes were too neat, too deliberate. Someone had been trying to tamper with the roots. The next morning, I checked my security camera footage, and there it was, a shadowy figure crouching near the base of the oak just after midnight. The video wasn't crystal clear, but the outline, the gait, the shape of the shoulders, it was unmistakably Glenn. That was when I realized this wasn't just about a tree. Glenn had made it personal. He wasn't just trying to prove a point. He wanted to win, to show me that his authority in this neighborhood was absolute. I started documenting everything. Every encounter, every notice from the HOA, every incident near the property line. Glenn might have had friends on the board, but I had something more powerful evidence. The battle lines were drawn. Glenn thought he could bully me into submission, that his influence would let him do whatever he pleased. But what he didn't realize was that I was patient, and I knew how to fight back. Because when you go after something that's been rooted in place for over 100 years, you better be prepared for what happens when those roots fight back. And as the next HOA meeting approached, I was ready. Ready to expose Glenn's lies, ready to show the footage, and ready to turn the entire neighborhood against him. The oak had stood for a century, and with my help, it wasn't going anywhere. The next HOA meeting was supposed to be routine, a quick discussion about landscaping guidelines and seasonal clean-up rules. But everyone in the neighborhood knew it was really about one thing: my tree. The oak had become the talk of the street. Some neighbors supported me quietly, saying the tree added charm and shade. Others, mostly Glenn's allies, whispered about liability and property value. The meeting took place in the community clubhouse, a sterile room with fluorescent lights and uncomfortable chairs. The board members sat at the front like a tribunal, and Glenn, smug as ever, took his seat beside them. He wasn't just a neighbor anymore. He had recently been appointed as a community safety advisor. It was a title he'd created for himself, and somehow the board approved it. From the moment the meeting started, it was clear Glenn had prepared his attack. He presented photos of fallen leaves on his driveway, exaggerated claims of damage from encroaching roots, and even a fabricated story about how the tree blocked emergency access. Each statement was more absurd than the last, but the board listened politely, nodding along as if he were some expert in forestry and law. When it was my turn to speak, I stayed calm. I had brought the survey map showing the tree was entirely within my property, as well as the city's environmental regulation confirming it was a protected heritage tree, meaning it couldn't legally be removed without city approval. I explained everything clearly, methodically, without emotion. But Glenn wasn't after logic. He was after perception. He shifted the narrative, accusing me of creating tension in the community, claiming I was uncooperative and disrespectful. It was classic manipulation. Make the reasonable person seem unreasonable, and it worked. By the end of the meeting, the board voted to further investigate the issue and postpone their decision. In other words, they sided with Glenn for now. After that, things only got worse. Glenn began his campaign of harassment. Every morning, I'd find new leaf piles raked dramatically onto his side of the property line, as if to prove a point. HOA notices started arriving weekly. Warnings for unmaintained landscaping, overhanging branches, and even visual obstructions. It was clear Glenn was behind them. His influence ran deep. Still, I didn't react. I let him dig his own hole, metaphorically, and, as it turned out, literally, because one night the cameras caught something again. Glenn, flashlight in hand, was back near the tree. This time, he wasn't just poking at the roots. He was sprinkling something from a container. A fine, white powder that glimmered in the light. When I checked in the morning, the soil looked strange, damp, almost chemical. My suspicion turned to dread. I took a sample to a friend who worked in landscaping, and what I found made my stomach drop. It was a root killer. Glenn was trying to poison my tree from underground. That was it. The line had been crossed. I documented everything. The video footage, the soil test results, the HOA notices, all of it. I sent copies to the city's environmental office and the police. I wasn't going to confront Glenn directly. Not yet. I wanted him to think he was winning, to grow overconfident. Days passed, and Glenn strutted around like he'd already triumphed. He bragged to anyone who would listen that the eyesore would be gone soon, but he didn't realize how slow his poison worked, or how quickly I'd acted. The city inspector arrived within a week, followed by an environmental specialist. They examined the roots, confirmed the contamination, and traced it back to Glenn's side of the property. When the city issued a formal citation for malicious environmental damage, the look on Glenn's face was priceless. He tried to play dumb, claiming ignorance, but the evidence was undeniable. He was fined heavily and ordered to pay for soil remediation. That should have been the end of it, but people like Glenn don't give up when they lose. They escalate. After the fine, he became obsessed. He spent hours every day standing at the edge of his driveway, staring at the tree as if it mocked him. He filed appeal after appeal with the HOA, claiming he was the victim of harassment. He even printed flyers accusing me of tampering with his property. It became a war of attrition. He wanted me exhausted, humiliated, forced to sell. But what Glenn didn't realize was that I wasn't playing defense anymore. The city's involvement had shifted everything. The HOA, terrified of liability, began to distance itself from him. Neighbors who once supported him quietly turned away, whispering about his weird obsession. His pristine image was cracking. And while Glenn was busy fighting everyone, I was working on something else. Something that would ensure he'd never touch my property again. Because Glenn had made one fatal mistake, he underestimated just how much I valued that tree and how far I was willing to go to protect it. The oak had stood for generations, and soon it would stand as a monument to his downfall. The days following Glenn's citation were strangely quiet. For the first time in weeks, the air around my property felt still, almost peaceful. The constant surveillance, the petty HOA notices, the glares from across the street, all of it seemed to vanish overnight. Glenn's yard was dark, his driveway empty, his blinds always drawn. But silence from someone like Glenn never meant surrender. It meant plotting. It began subtly. I'd wake to find my garbage cans knocked over, my mailbox slightly bent, or muddy footprints leading across my front lawn. Minor inconveniences, small enough to be dismissed as coincidence. But the pattern was too deliberate. I started noticing shadows near the tree late at night, not close enough to do damage, but close enough to watch. Then came the flood of anonymous complaints. The HOA mailbox overflowed with letters claiming I was disturbing community harmony, attracting pests, and owing unsafe structures. The unsafe structure was apparently my treehouse, a small wooden platform I'd built years ago for my nephew, still tucked safely in the branches. Glenn's influence, though weakened, wasn't gone. He was using whatever connections he had left to grind me down. The HOA, terrified of another scandal, launched a formal inspection of my property. The president, a nervous woman who'd once sided with Glenn, arrived with 2 board members and a clipboard. They measured, photographed, and scribbled notes like federal agents at a crime scene. But despite their best efforts, everything was in compliance. The grass, the fences, the treehouse, all perfectly legal. Still, the investigation served its purpose to remind me that Glenn wasn't finished. One night, around midnight, the calm finally broke. I woke to the faint buzz of machinery outside my window. At first, I thought it was a passing car, but then I saw it. The faint shimmer of headlights near the tree. Glenn was there, wearing work gloves and holding a chainsaw. He was actually going to do it. Before I could even move, a loud crack split the air, not from the tree, but from Glenn's own tool. His chainsaw had jammed. He cursed, kicked the machine, and looked around nervously. For a brief moment, our eyes met through the window. He froze, realizing he'd been caught, then scrambled back to his house, dragging the chainsaw behind him like a weapon of shame. By morning, I'd already contacted the authorities. The footage from my security cameras was crystal clear this time. When the police arrived at his door, he tried denying it, claiming he was checking noise near the tree. But his fingerprints on the chainsaw told a different story. The incident made waves across the entire neighborhood. Word spread fast, faster than even Glenn could control. Some residents were horrified, others vindicated. For years, Glenn had been the self-proclaimed enforcer of HOA order, the model homeowner. Now everyone saw him for what he was, a bitter, obsessed man trying to destroy what wasn't his. The HOA held an emergency meeting that week. Glenn was removed from all advisory positions and placed under probation pending further legal review. His yard, once the picture of manicured perfection, began to show signs of neglect. Overgrown weeds crept up the fence line, and his once perfect lawn turned patchy and dull. But even humiliation couldn't stop him. I noticed him watching from his window at all hours, scribbling in a notebook, making calls. I didn't know what he was planning, but I knew it wasn't over. A man like Glenn couldn't stand defeat. He had to rewrite the narrative. It was a few weeks later when I discovered his next move. A city notice arrived at my doorstep, stating that my oak tree was being re-evaluated for public safety concerns. Someone had reported it as unstable and posing risk to nearby property. The timing was too convenient to be coincidence. When the inspector arrived, he seemed almost apologetic. He explained that a complaint had been filed, complete with photographic evidence, showing cracks near the trunk and decaying roots. But when he examined the tree himself, he found nothing of the sort. The photos were fakes, digitally altered images designed to trick the city into authorizing removal. Glenn had gone from petty harassment to full-blown forgery. I could have taken it to court right then, but I decided to wait. I wanted the full scope of his actions exposed. So I let the city finish their review, knowing they'd find no basis for removal. And when the report came back in my favor, I used it, along with all the previous evidence, to file a formal harassment and property interference claim. The case didn't just name Glenn. It also included the HOA, citing their negligence in allowing his harassment to continue unchecked. Suddenly, the same board that had once ignored my concerns was scrambling to distance themselves, hiring lawyers, issuing apologies, and trying to settle quietly. But Glenn couldn't hide behind them anymore. The city had already opened an investigation into his forged documents, and his reputation was in ruins. Neighbors stopped speaking to him, kids avoided his house, and his once inviting porch light stayed off every night. I thought that might finally be the end of it. But Glenn had one last card to play. One final, desperate act that would turn the entire neighborhood upside down. Because when a man like him has nothing left to lose, that's when he's most dangerous. And I was about to find out just how far he was willing to go. The calm that followed Glenn's public downfall felt almost surreal. For weeks, I'd lived under constant tension, waiting for the next letter, the next complaint, the next confrontation. But now, my mailbox stayed empty, my security cameras captured nothing but stray cats, and my tree swayed peacefully in the morning breeze. The oak, once a symbol of neighborhood conflict, had become a quiet monument of resistance. Neighbors walking their dogs would slow down just to admire it, offering faint smiles in my direction. Even the HOA, once so eager to enforce arbitrary rules, had grown cautious. Their meetings were quieter, their inspections less frequent, their threats hollow. But underneath that fragile peace, something darker brewed. It began with whispers. Rumors spreading through the neighborhood, stories about me being litigious, unstable, even vindictive. At first, I brushed them off as gossip, the kind that always circulates when someone stands up to power. But soon I noticed subtle changes. People stopped waving. Kids who used to play on my sidewalk crossed to the other side of the street. Even the mailman seemed reluctant to linger. Glenn had found a new strategy: isolation. Though disgraced, he still had a few loyal friends, older residents who saw him as a victim of unjust persecution. Through them, he began to rebuild his influence, crafting a new narrative. In his version of events, I was the aggressor. The tree wasn't a symbol of harassment. It was an Yizor. The lawsuits weren't justice. They were revenge. He even started a private Facebook group for residents, titled Preserve Our Neighborhood. It masqueraded as a community forum but quickly devolved into a smear campaign. Every post was twisted, every story slanted to make me look unreasonable. He posted pictures of the oak's falling leaves on neighboring lawns, claiming it caused property damage. He shared cropped photos of my yard, implying neglect. The digital harassment spread fast. Before long, I was the villain in a story I hadn't written. Then came the vandalism, small at first. Eggs thrown at my fence, oil stains on my driveway, a broken sprinkler head. But the most disturbing incident happened one morning when I found a crude message scrawled across my garage in black spray paint. CUTITWLR Boyel? I reported it immediately, but the police could only take notes and file a report. Without direct evidence, there was nothing they could do. Still, I knew exactly who was behind it. Glenn's handiwork had always carried that same mix of arrogance and cowardice. Bold enough to threaten, but never to confront. The message did something unexpected, though. It reignited my determination. I realized Glenn wasn't just obsessed with the tree. He was obsessed with control. My refusal to bend had shattered the illusion of authority he'd built over years of intimidation. And now, stripped of his status, he was unraveling. So I decided to fight smarter. I began documenting everything, not just incidents, but patterns. Dates, times, screenshots, every whisper of defamation that could be traced back to him. I hired a private investigator to quietly monitor activity near my property, especially at night. Cameras were upgraded, motion sensors installed, and floodlights programmed to trigger at the slightest movement. It didn't take long for results to surface. Within 2 weeks, the investigator caught Glenn trespassing again. This time, not near the tree, but near the back fence, where he'd been planting small metal spikes in the grass. His goal was clear: to injure my dog or anyone walking near the area. The footage was damning. I forwarded it to both the police and the HOA, ensuring the entire board saw it. This time, the response was swift. Glenn was charged with trespassing and animal endangerment. His property was searched, revealing a stash of yard tools, chemicals, and a notebook filled with detailed plans. Maps of my yard, notes about my routines, even sketches of the tree. It wasn't just harassment anymore. It was obsession. The arrest shattered the last remnants of his credibility. The HOA issued a public statement condemning his behavior and promising to cooperate fully with authorities. Neighbors who had once stayed silent began to speak out, admitting they'd witnessed suspicious behavior, but had been too afraid to intervene. For the first time, Glenn was truly alone, but I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. His house sat dark at night, his windows boarded, yet every so often, I'd catch a flicker of light, a sign that he was still there, still watching. The police assured me that he was under strict orders to stay away, but restraining orders are only as strong as the paper they're printed on. Then, one stormy night, it happened again. The thunder rolled across the neighborhood like distant artillery. The rain came down in sheets, hammering the roof and flooding the gutters. I went to check on the oak, worried the wind might be too strong. That's when I saw him, a dark figure near the trunk, barely visible through the rain. Before I could react, lightning flashed, illuminating everything for a single, blinding instant. The figure wasn't Glenn. It was someone younger, a man in his 20s, wearing a hoodie and carrying a gas can. A sick realization hit me. Glenn had found someone else to do his dirty work. The next moments were chaos. The floodlights kicked on, alarms blared, and the intruder bolted, but not before splashing gasoline at the base of the tree. I grabbed a hose and doused the roots before any flames could catch. The fire never started, but the message was clear. This wasn't about property anymore. It was about destruction. The police were called again, and the investigation widened. It turned out the young man had been hired through a local gig website, paid in cash by someone using a fake name and burner phone. But the pattern of calls, traced through nearby towers, led straight back to Glenn's address. It was enough for another arrest. This time, the charges were serious: conspiracy, property destruction, and violation of a restraining order. Glenn was taken away in handcuffs as the neighborhood watched from their windows. I thought that would finally be the end. But standing in my driveway that night, watching the police cars fade into the rain, I couldn't shake the feeling that this story wasn't over yet, because people like Glenn, people consumed by control, don't just disappear quietly. And in the shadows of that storm, I sensed one final reckoning waiting to unfold. The weeks following Glenn's second arrest were eerily quiet. For the first time in months, the air around my home felt still. No suspicious footsteps at night, no cryptic notes, no angry mutterings from across the hedge. The oak stood proud and calm, its branches stretching high over the street as if reclaiming its space after a long siege. Neighbors began warming up again, cautiously at first. They'd wave as they passed, sometimes stopping to admire the tree or comment on how peaceful things seemed. It felt like the neighborhood was healing, slowly untangling itself from Glenn's web of manipulation and fear. But beneath that calm surface, I couldn't relax. Glenn had already proven how far he was willing to go, and men like him didn't accept defeat easily. The idea that he could still be skimming somewhere gnawed at me. I kept my cameras on, my lights bright, and my doors locked tighter than ever. Then, about a month after his arrest, I received a letter in the mail. A plain white envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly, printed with one line in bold black font. "You took everything from me. I'll take it back." My stomach dropped. I called the police immediately, but since there was no direct threat and no proof it came from Glenn, they could only file another report. Still, I knew his style. The precision, the quiet menace, it was him. Somehow, even behind bars or under restriction, he had found a way to reach out. It turned out my instincts were right. Glenn had been released on bail pending trial. The charges against him were serious, but his lawyer had managed to argue for conditional freedom until court proceedings began. I learned this from the investigator I'd hired, a man who, at this point, had become something of a lifeline. The realization filled me with dread. Glenn was free again, and though legally restrained from coming near me, he didn't need proximity to cause damage. And damage, it seemed, was exactly what he intended. One morning, I woke to find that someone had dumped a massive pile of rotting mulch and garbage across the entrance to my driveway. Buried inside the mess were shattered branches that looked eerily familiar. When I looked closer, I saw the truth: they were from the oak. Someone had cut small sections from its lower limbs in the dead of night. That same day, the HOA received an anonymous complaint claiming that my tree was infected with rot and posed a safety hazard. The board sent a letter demanding I remove it within 30 days or face daily fines. The timing wasn't coincidence. Glenn was behind it. He couldn't cut down the tree himself, so he was trying to make the system do it for him. I refused to comply and gathered evidence once more. An arborist confirmed in writing that the tree was perfectly healthy. I forwarded the report to the HOA and threatened to file harassment claims if the fines weren't withdrawn. The board, nervous and wary of legal trouble, backed down. But Glenn didn't stop. Over the next 2 weeks, I was bombarded with new issues. My trash cans mysteriously vanished, then reappeared in the middle of the road. My mailbox was stuffed with flyers for tree removal services. Someone even posted on the neighborhood app offering cheap tree cutting help using my address. It was psychological warfare designed to exhaust me into giving up. I almost did, until something changed. One morning, I found a small package sitting on my porch. Inside was a cheap drone, still powered on, with a micro SD card in its slot. Curious and cautious, I plugged it into my laptop. The footage showed a bird's eye view of my property, specifically the tree. The video zoomed in and out, focusing on branches, the base, even the windows of my house. But what caught my eye wasn't the footage itself. It was the background. In one frame, the drone's camera accidentally captured Glenn standing in his backyard, holding a controller. His smirk, his posture, unmistakable. The timestamp was from 2 nights prior, long after he was supposed to stay away. That was the break I needed. I sent the footage to the police and my lawyer. Within days, they obtained a warrant for Glenn's arrest, this time for violating his restraining order and stalking. The evidence was airtight. He was taken into custody again, and this time denied bail. The neighborhood erupted in gossip, word spread fast, and the last few defenders he had left went silent. Even the HOA, embarrassed for not acting sooner, released another statement condemning his behavior and promising reform. For the first time, real change began to take root. New members were voted onto the board, replacing those who had been complicit or cowardly. Rules were rewritten, transparency introduced, and neighbors began holding each other accountable for fairness rather than fear. It was strange watching the tide turn so completely. Glenn's downfall didn't just remove a bully, it seemed to cleanse the entire neighborhood of its toxicity. I spent the following weekends restoring my yard. I replanted flowers, cleaned the fence, and hung new solar lanterns in the branches of the oak. When the lights flickered on each night, the tree looked almost magical, a glowing monument to resilience. Still, in the quiet of those evenings, a lingering thought haunted me. Glenn's obsession had consumed so much of his life. His reputation, his standing, even his freedom. A man that obsessed didn't just give up. He brooded. He plotted. And deep down, I feared there was one last card he hadn't played. That card revealed itself one foggy morning, about 2 weeks before his court date. A utility crew showed up outside my house, claiming they'd been sent to evaluate root damage beneath the street. When I asked for paperwork, they seemed confused. Their order had come from a neighborhood representative. The name listed on their form, Glenn. He had somehow forged documents to authorize the city to dig near my property. If I hadn't caught it, they would have damaged the roots of the tree permanently. That was the final straw. I compiled everything, the letters, the drone footage, the forged documents, the harassment logs, and sent them to the prosecutor handling his case. When his trial came, the evidence painted a clear picture of obsession turned criminal. Glenn wasn't just a difficult neighbor. He was dangerous. As the verdict approached, I stood beneath my oak and felt the weight of it all. The months of fear, anger, and exhaustion lift just slightly. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing. Glenn's war was coming to an end. The morning of Glenn's trial arrived gray and cold, as if the sky itself was holding its breath. Months of chaos, tension, and fear had built up to this moment. The quiet of the neighborhood felt different now, not peaceful, but expectant, like everyone knew this was the end of something. By then, Glenn had become a ghost story whispered between driveways. His house sat abandoned, grass uncut, mail piled high on the porch. A faded FOR sell sign leaned against his fence, though everyone knew no one would buy it. The once proud HOA president, the self-proclaimed guardian of order, was now just a cautionary tale. But I didn't celebrate yet, not until the verdict was spoken aloud. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was heavy. The evidence against Glenn was overwhelming: hours of video footage, the drone recordings, the spray-painted threats, even testimony from neighbors who'd once feared him. Each piece painted the same picture: a man who couldn't stand losing control, a man who turned obsession into warfare. When the verdict was finally read, it was decisive. Guilty on all counts: harassment, stalking, property destruction, forgery, and violation of restraining orders. His sentence wasn't light: several years in prison, along with mandatory psychological evaluation and a restraining order that would remain in effect indefinitely after his release. It was justice. But more than that, it was closure. For the first time since that day he'd stood in my yard with his smug grin and empty threats, I felt free. Free from the weight of paranoia, the constant watchfulness, the fear that one man's ego could dictate the peace of my home. When I returned to the neighborhood, it was as if a veil had lifted. People were outside again, tending their lawns, chatting on sidewalks. Kids played basketball in driveways. The HOA, now under new leadership, worked to restore community spirit instead of enforcing control. They even held a neighborhood barbecue, the first in years, and invited everyone, myself included. And at the center of it all stood my oak tree. It had survived everything: saw blades, poison, storms, and fire. Its trunk bore scars, faint lines of past attempts to harm it, but those marks only made it more beautiful. In a strange way, it mirrored what I had endured. What was once a simple tree had become something far greater: a symbol of resilience, of standing firm against cruelty disguised as order. Neighbors began calling it the survivor. Kids hung tiny birdhouses from its branches, painted bright colors that glowed in the sunlight. At night, solar lights wrapped around the trunk shimmered like constellations. It had become the heart of the block, something everyone took pride in, even those who once complained about its shade. Yet even in victory, I couldn't help but think back on everything Glenn had cost us. The division, the fear, the suspicion. It all stemmed from one man's obsession with control. And I realized something that day: HOAs and neighborhood rules weren't the true villains. It was the people who wielded them like weapons. I made it my quiet mission to prevent that from happening again. When elections came for the new HOA board, several neighbors encouraged me to run. At first, I refused. I'd had enough of neighborhood politics to last a lifetime. But then I thought of the tree, of how Glenn's abuse of power had nearly destroyed it, and how silence had enabled him for so long, so I ran. Not to control, but to protect. I won easily. People remembered what I'd endured, what I'd exposed, and they trusted that I wouldn't let history repeat itself. From that point forward, I made sure every decision, every rule, every fine served a purpose: fairness, safety, respect. The community changed, slowly but unmistakably. Over time, the neighborhood's tone transformed. Instead of meetings filled with tension, laughter filled the air. Instead of petty complaints, residents came with ideas. Block parties, community gardens, charity events. The same HOA that had once been a tool of intimidation was now a force of connection. Years passed. The oak grew taller, its roots deeper, its branches wider. I often sat beneath it in the evenings, coffee in hand, listening to the hum of crickets and the distant chatter of families. Sometimes I thought about Glenn, where he was, what he thought about while sitting in a cell somewhere. Did he regret it? Or did he still blame me for everything that happened? I supposed it didn't matter anymore. His downfall had taught me something essential: that standing your ground, even against relentless pressure, could change more than your own circumstances. It could change an entire community. People who had once been afraid to speak now stood firm. Neighbors who once looked away now looked out for one another. The neighborhood that had been defined by fear now thrived on respect. One spring morning, years after it all began, I noticed something small but profound. A new tree was growing near the sidewalk. A sapling, probably planted by one of the neighborhood kids. It leaned slightly toward the oak, its branches tiny but reaching upward as if seeking guidance. It made me smile. The legacy of that battle wasn't just survival. It was growth, new roots, new beginnings, born from old scars. The oak had inspired it, and in a way, so had Glenn's downfall. because even from destruction, something good can take root if you nurture it. As the wind rustled through the leaves, sunlight breaking through the branches, I felt peace. The kind of peace that only comes when you've faced the storm and come out stronger. The oak creaked softly, its branches swaying in the breeze like a living reminder that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just stands tall, quietly unmovable, patient. The same could be said for me. And so, the man who tried to cut down my tree ended up cutting down his own future. In the end, nature, and a little persistence, had the last laugh.